done that found that hockey fans are more likely to have heart attacks than non-hockey fans. So don't take the game too seriously. Don't take it too seriously. Those are Montreal fans. Okay, Stuart. We all do need breaks from realities, though, sometimes, I think. Because sometimes reality can just be too much to handle. World events leave us in shock. And even those daily battles that we have to get everything done on our to-do list that we feel have to get done, even trying to get all those things done can leave us feeling exhausted and spent and perhaps even anxious as the day winds down because we worry about everything that we have left to do for tomorrow. And despite living in one of the wealthiest countries in the world, in the wealthiest time in our world's existence, people today are filled with more anxiety and stress and depression than ever before, it seems. It may, I would suggest, have something to do with this, what I might call an epidemic of consumerism that we face every day in our culture. Jesus in his gospel today actually is making a connection between the concern for material things, which we might call consumerism, or one form of it, a connection between material things and worry or anxiety. And he does this in this section of his most famous sermon that we call the Sermon on the Mount. Now he points his audience to the birds of the air and to the lilies of the field, who are wonderfully cared for by their Creator. Are you not more valuable than they? He asks. Now, I'm sure his audience, at least many in his audience, had good reason to be a little anxious, a little worried. Because I think many of that group, coming from the region of Galilee, would have wondered where their next meal was to come from. Many of them lived in poverty, or slightly above poverty. And the concerns for food and water and clothing, for a lot of them, were very real, more so than I can even imagine. And yet Jesus encourages them not to worry. And I think he does this because worrying poisons the enjoyment of life. And it exposes a lack of faith, as he sort of teases them, you of little faith. God will provide, he asserts. So do not worry and focus on doing the things that you're supposed to be doing, the works of the kingdom. Now, I don't think that Jesus is talking about what we today would call clinical anxiety and depression. We know these are legitimate mental health disorders. I'm sure many of us here today have themselves faced these infirmities either personally or through friends or family members. I'm not suggesting that summoning up enough faith in God is a cure-all for mental illness. But I do think that how we view our lives and how we view the events in the world can greatly affect our mental state. Both those of us who have struggled with mental illness and those who have not. An example of this, of course, is the horrific events that we witnessed in Las Vegas this week. I feel a little bit like former President Barack Obama, who had to get up and address his nation after every shooting. And after several of these shootings, over the span of some years, sort of confessed that he's running out of words. I get that. I feel that way. How do we address such a terrible tragedy? It's such a horrific act of violence. It staggers us. It blows our mind that an individual could perpetuate such targeted, intentional violence. And I'm shocked enough by that. But the other thing I'm feeling, and perhaps some of you feel this way too, is the fact that this keeps happening. They say this was a record number of deaths in a mass shooting in the United States in modern history, a record that was broken a year and a half ago. There should be much greater time, I think, between these things. But see, I think like former President Obama was feeling, I think many of us feel the sense of hopelessness in that it never seems to change. And the things that might prevent these things from happening, people are resistant to. History suggests this is going to happen again. And so while we grieve and while we mourn and while we pray and while we hope and wish good upon all those affected by such tragedy, I think there's also this sense hanging within us. So when is this going to stop? When is this going to change? I imagine that's like the feeling that the people of God in ancient times must have felt. Those in particular living in exile. See, when the nation of Israel would get conquered by an army, an empire, they would take all the best resources, food, gold, and people, the skilled laborers, and they would separate them from families, and they would take them to the far reaches of the empire. And here are these people living in exile, away from their homeland, not free to practice their religion, not free to even speak their language in some cases. And their suffering was real. They suffered in slavery. They suffered being dislocated. They suffered their sense of identity and who they were and where they came from. The people back home would have their economy be collapsed, food would be scarce. But in the midst of all that, there were some who were able to seek covert opportunities to cry out to Yahweh, their God. And those cries were cries of asking why and how and when is this going to change? When will you deliver us, O God? When will you save us? When will you defeat our enemies and restore us again? Had God forgotten them? Were they being punished for their sins? Would God forgive them? Would they dare to dream again? The author of Psalm 26, the psalm we heard this morning, dared to dream. When the Lord restored the fortunes of Zion, he writes, we were like those who dream. Zion was used as a synonym for Jerusalem in those days, that also carried with it the sense of God's favor and presence. This psalm is a psalm of ascent. It's a psalm that would be read or sung as the people would process towards the temple to worship, literally ascending up the hill to worship. There are 15 psalms of ascent, one for each of the 15 steps up to the temple. And this psalm celebrates the reunion between God and God's people. But it is also an act of remembering that grounds the people in hope. The Lord has done great things for us, the psalmist quotes the people. When the people make use of these kinds of faith declarations, they speak not only of current events they are grateful for, but they retrieve a library of instances when God has proven faithful. They remember the promise to Abraham. They remember the deliverance from Egypt, the provision in the desert. They remember the victory over enemies who would seek to eradicate them. They remember finally arriving at the promised land. And there are rich history was filled with tumult and suffering. Yet the one constant was that their God would redeem and restore the people, that God would not forget them, that God was with them. And so they may, with sincere and honest faith, declare that those sowing tears would reap the fruits of joy. This is a promise that Israel would literally be restored as a people, that those in exile would be allowed to return home and rebuild their lives. But I also believe that this language curiously points to how pain and suffering carries with it the potential or potency to birth beauty and new life. The people of God suffered immensely in ancient times. And yet out of that suffering came a restored relationship with their Creator, renewed their social conscience to care for the vulnerable, and have filled their hearts with gratitude for each and every blessing. Now, it's hard for me to believe that joy can come from this tragedy in Las Vegas, or from any act of violence for that matter. And maybe that's too difficult a word for us to use today. But I will choose not to let one man's act speak for the entire human race. One man committed a terrible atrocity, but hundreds and thousands shielded each other, cared for each other, provided medical aid, and filled blood banks. They showed the capacity for good. And I want to share a few of their stories with you in closing today. You may have heard these stories already, but I believe they bear repeating. There's the story of Dawn Marie Gray and her husband Kevin, who attended this concert after winning tickets in a radio contest. And they were enjoying this Aldine concert Sunday night when the bullets began to rain down. And the Grays took cover inside a VIP area until the gunfire had stopped. When we came out, it was horrific, Dawn Marie said. A field of bodies. Having worked as a paramedic for almost 7 years, Dawn Marie knew the local paramedics could not move in until it was safe to do so. So she and her husband turned their attention to the injured. They provided CPR, tourniquets, holding pressure on wounds, she said. And the Grays were not alone. They were joined by other off-duty doctors and nurses and paramedics who happened to be at the concert. Dawn Marie was asked if that made her a hero. She said, "That's just being a human being. That's doing our job." Jonathan Smith, age 30, was in Las Vegas celebrating his brother's birthday. His brother was a big country music fan and was attending this concert with him. When the gunfire rang out, Jonathan was looking for his family immediately, and they had scurried to cover. He had a hard time seeing them, but what he did see was that there was a large number of attendees to the concert that were hiding behind this police car, but not in a way that would shield them or protect them from the shooter. And so he called out, active shooter, let's go, we have to run." And so he would shout, and he'd grab the people and help kind of move them, and actually even formed a human chain to help take them from this spot to this handicapped parking area where there were several rows of cars that would provide them adequate shelter. He estimates that he directed about 30 people to safety when he stood up to urge a few young girls who weren't fully hidden to get to the ground for cover. And when he did so, he himself was struck in the neck with a bullet. He's fractured collarbone, a cracked rib, and a bruised lung. But the doctors are leaving the bullet in his neck for the time being, fearing that moving it might cause more damage. Some asked whether he could think of himself as a hero, and he said, "I'm not a hero." He did say, "I might have to live with this bullet for the rest of my life." Lastly, there's the story of a woman, Heather Goose, who was a bartender at a bar right beside the concert venue. And she was working, and when people began to run in looking for shelter. And there were 3 men carrying a victim, Jordan McKilden. They were bringing him on a ladder. And they were trying to use his phone or to contact people. And she said his phone was locked, but Facebook messages kept popping up on the screen. So she went on Facebook to find him, and she sent messages to everyone that had his same last name until he could finally reach a family member to tell them what had happened. And she said, I promised them that we wouldn't leave him. And I was with him when he took his last breath. May those who sow in tears reap with shouts of joy. Those who go out weeping, bearing the seed for sowing, shall come home with shouts of joy, carrying their sheaves. Many tears are rightly offered over the shedding of innocent blood. But let us have eyes of faith to see the fruit of compassion that has sprung up from these tears, and know that in all our sorrows and adversities, God is still with us. May that truth make us truly grateful on this Thanksgiving. Amen.